In this chapter, Erickson is going to discuss the results of sin. In other words, now that we've established the fact that sin's pretty much something we have to struggle with, the question is, what results does it actually have in our lives? The first thing is results affecting relationships. We experience divine disfavor, guilt, punishment, also death. And in Christianity, physical death is portrayed as a punishment for sin. Romans 3:23, for the wages of sin is death. Romans 6:23, physical death was not intended for the creation. There are some types of theology that deny this, but actually historical Orthodox Christian theology views physical death as a punishment. And of course, there's also the aspect of what is called spiritual death. Spiritual death would be those who have not come to God, who are walking in darkness. And then eternal death would be the state of those who never come to God and eternally are punished in some way as a result. So that would be eternal death. So all of that would be under the general rubric then of death as affecting our lives. But more effects would be things like enslavement, flight from reality, denial, self-deceit. We can't be honest with ourselves. Insensitivity, self-centeredness, restlessness. All of these are sort of characteristics of people that we have encountered, or that perhaps characteristics that we have portrayed at times in our lives. All due to the fact that we're not imbalanced, that our systems are not completely coordinate with God's will for us. And the effects on relationships, like 2 Corinthians 10:12. And this is really an interesting scripture. Paul says this in verse 12, "For we dare not make ourselves of the number or compare ourselves with some that commend themselves, but they, measuring themselves by themselves and comparing themselves among themselves, are not wise." And that's just a really neat little scripture, because as you all know the background of Corinthians, it was a church that was divided by factions, warring with one another and competing with one another. And Paul is simply saying that this is not the way Christians should live. Competition can be overdone. Then there's an inability to empathize, to feel for other people. Then there's a rejection of authority, automatically rebel, and an inability to love. And all of these things are indicative of the effect of sin upon our relationships. One little example of how this can work in our lives is supplied by the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. Some people say Kierkegaard, you can say either, but Kierkegaard described the spiritual life as proceeding from stage to stage. He said that the first stage we go through is what he called the aesthetic stage. Now this is journeying toward conversion. He said people in the aesthetic stage initially experience the desire only for essential immediacy. All they want is just immediate gratification. And this he characterizes in his writings by the character of Don Juan. And there's a lack of involvement, an inability to make moral decisions, and restlessness. It typifies so many of our lives when we wandered without knowing where to go. But having journeyed that way so far, you reach a second stage called doubt, characterized by the character of Faust in his writings. And those people in this stage are unable to remain satisfied. Often any happiness they have is just a veneer for real despair. And he characterizes this in his writings by the character of Ahasuerus, the wandering Jew. There's a complete absence of hope, but salvation comes then when we experience absolute despair. We leap to a new stage of existence. In other words, out of doubt, out of despair, we can actually come to a higher stage. In your life, for example, have things ever reached the point where they're so bad, so negative that you just laugh? Things are so hopeless that you just laugh at all, that you can't go on. And what Kierkegaard is saying is, in your life, when you've reached the absolute point where you can't go any further and everything seems completely gone, then at that point you just decide you're going to survive anyway, and you're going to do what you have to do. And so you affirm an absolute choice and you say, I will survive. And that's what he calls the ethical stage. And in this stage you choose with passion and without condition. The idea is not to just know the truth, but to become the truth. Once you do this, you experience a sense of inner coherence and vocation. You've decided that you're going to follow and you are going to survive. And at that point, Kierkegaard says you're ready for true religion, which can be of two kinds, either religiousness A, the religion of Eminence and Socrates, or religiousness B, that of the other, Jesus Christ. And what he really meant is, in the Denmark of Kierkegaard's day, there was basically a kind of religiousness where Lutheranism was the state religion. So everybody born in Denmark was a Christian because everybody born was baptized. Religiousness was a matter of agreeing with a theological system that was almost governmental, with a state religion. And so there really was no life in it to Kierkegaard. But he said the real religion is religiousness B, when we cast ourselves upon that of the other, Jesus Christ. So he said that's what real religion is. Kierkegaard, incidentally, was a biblical Christian. I disagree with him philosophically, and his sincere attempt to emphasize faith sometimes conflicts a little bit with a sound view of the Bible, but at the same time, he understood faith, and he was an outstanding Christian person. So he's somebody you might like to read in your religious journeys.